to Sri Sadguru Jnanananda Saraswati and Swami Shrihariprasd. It's a unique opportunity for spiritual evolution to be asked by Sri Swami Hariprasd to deliver the Sri T.R. Pattabiraman Memorial Endowment Lecture this year. I am grateful to Swamiji and the family of Sri Pattabiraman, especially Srimati Sri Vidya, an ardent devotee of Sadguru Ma, Sri Peetam, for honouring me with this invitation to give the endowment lecture this year in memory of her father. Thank you, Madam. I thought first of speaking on the subject of religion and gender. I must say something. I am not talking in the Madras University. I am talking in an institution which has certain spiritual and social obligations to society. So I am not trying to increase my curriculum vitae by adding one more lecture. So I had to just locate the topic in terms of the objective of this institution. They don't bind you. We are free people here. But we must see how it can be made relevant. So I just thought, first I will speak on religion and gender, which is one of my favorite areas. However, my experience in the last few months of watching the public debates by intellectuals on various aspects of Indian civilization and our composite culture set me thinking on the gravity of the situation and made me veer towards the topic of today's talk. When I briefly outlined it some time earlier to Swamiji, he was so positive and encouraging that I thought of proceeding with my efforts to get a greater acquaintance with the debates concerning the topic. Everybody has asked me, what is this topic about? Only my uncle Raghavan said, I am deeply interested in this topic, I am glad I could just make it. And Swamiji never asked me, what is the relevance of this topic? Because he made me understand the relevance of this topic. I confess to Swamiji that about my intellectual inefficiency, deficiency and lack of reading in this area, but I was impelled to share my thoughts in the hallowed precincts of Sri Peetam. I also felt that what Swamiji has been doing in the last few years under the aegis of Sri Vishnu Mohan Foundation in terms of seminars, conferences, satsangs, pujas, interfaith meetings, silent seva, such as feeding the poor regularly, renovating temples, synagogues and even mass, I think, was precisely aimed at creating a harmonious sense of living among people of different backgrounds and bridging the gap between the past and the present, using Sadguru's Pitti Upadeshams, which contain nuggets for liberation in every sense of the term. Thus, I have ventured to accept the invitation. I make it very clear to you, I am not standing here as a religious person, divinity school person, nor am I like Professor Radha, who is an authority on various subjects, nor am I like my favorite colleague, Professor Paneer Selvam, who is a philosopher with whom I have fought for several decades in Madras University, but I am standing as a lay person like you and me to understand who we are and what is our present situation. What I have understood is the debates touching on some critical spheres in our lives in India, such as faith, our identity, individual and collective. You remember when the Ayodhya verdict was passed, Hindu Ram criticized it, saying that faith cannot be a subject or a basis for litigation or a pronouncement, judgment on this. But we are basically grounded in faith, our identity, our individual and collective identity, the intellectual and political engagements with polemical issues, and also reflect on how we can contribute to a better epistemological understanding of who we are and what our civilization stands for. Some of the aspects of the ongoing debates in the public domain are: 1. History and the problematics of historiography. 2. Negative perceptions of India in the world in the economic and social domains. 3. Cultural and linguistic divides and the idea of nation. 4. Orientalism and the challenges it faces from Neo-Orientalism. It feels like standing in Madras University and giving talks on critical theory and literary theory to class of MAs and seminar courses. After placing the arguments and counter-arguments on these issues, I shall endeavour to raise the questions. What is the role of religious and spiritual institutions in steering India toward a better position? Why cannot religious institutions and organizations engage in deeper studies to produce a body of knowledge which will remove some of the misrepresentations in the global perception? Why cannot intellectuals and aspirants who do not accept the current mainstream diagnosis of the issue of what ails India endeavour to produce, create new values, as J. Krishnamurthy suggested, of the educational field in many of his talks and writings, which will heal the long-nursed wounds, close the fault lines, and facilitate a more enlightened living in the light of the profound truths embedded in our tradition. The fault lines threaten to split the subcontinent, even as the Great Rift Valley in Eastern Africa is witnessing the geological splitting of the African continent and the emergence of a new ocean between them. They are prized open wider by the sociological, anthropological and economic researches undertaken, especially in the last 20 years. Technology has facilitated this process of intellectual tectonic plate movement, dividing people from people, knowledge from knowledge. However, there is the other older side of our civilization, which Rajiv Malhotra calls wisdom or jnana, in which the present-day intellectual minds are not interested to research and, what is more, employ it in our daily life because it may run their steam out. Now is the time to think how best to revive the storehouse of wisdom in our culture and civilization to move the society in the direction of a more fruitful, futuristic and intellectual engagements. History. History has become the most contentious ground all over the world in all cultures, especially since the post-colonial era. The idea of history as representing a universal truth is contested by warring groups. As for India, the existing perspective since independence has been heavily biased towards the colonial, the left, Marxist and the Nehruvian model of thought. The image of India as a defeated nation, in fact lacking in any sense of a nation, its people as enslaved by one invader or the other, is the image most Indians have come to stoically accept. Further, there is the general idea that Indians don't have a historical sense, but have been governed by myth and Purana in matters of space and time. The existing model of history elaborates on various foreign dynasties. Who were the people who conquered us? How many times we were defeated? We are a slave nation. This is the idea that we have just almost, you see, it is there in our, built into our genes, I should say. So, various foreign dynasties that ruled us while hardly touching on other indigenous and native empires and kingdoms and their cultures. Nor does it mention some instances of valorous armed struggle against colonial powers except the Indian Mutiny. This approach has been seriously challenged by present-day India studies scholars. They point out that our history books give prominence to a small dynasty like the Lodis. Lodi colony is there in Delhi. Where everybody will know where Lodi colony is there. But if you have a street name now, Vedanta Desika street, nobody will know. Okay, they will know Akbar a little, Aurangzeb more because of the controversy, but they will not know other things, and therefore you have a problem. The problem is that the small dynasty like Lodi, but not substantial space to Chola or Vijayanagara or Satavahana or the Ahom dynasty or the Pallava dynasty, who have contributed immensely to the art and architecture, polity and governance of this country. Sanjeev Sanyal, an economist and historian, challenges such a negative view of the Indians and underscores the maritime history of both Indian Ocean and Western seas, especially pertaining to the southern peninsula, which engaged in rich trade on both sides. He stresses the need for an Indian Ocean history perspective to highlight the South Indian achievement via his book, The Ocean of the Churn, and his other public talks and the interviews that he gave. He uses this Indian Ocean history perspective to counter what he calls the Delhi-centric and Ashoka-centric histories. Since Delhi is a landlocked region, he says, ocean history has been blotted out. Sanjeev Sanyal gives the example of Suhaldev, Lachit Barpukhan, Bajirao I and Martanda Varma, who defied the foreign conquerors. Martanda Varma's defeat of the Dutch army in Kolachal in the tip of India was a game changer in Indian history, but it hardly finds a mention in mainstream history. Sanyal questions the Nehruvian project of Emperor Ashoka as a pacifist and socialist. He cites alternative sources to show that Ashoka was already a Buddhist when he invaded Kalinga and killed tens of thousands and ordered the beheading of the Ajivikas in Orissa. Sanyal cites the Orissa ruler Karavela's inscription, how Karavela went to the Magad Empire and killed the ruling Mauryan king to establish the pride of Kalinga. Sanyal also points out that Ashoka's inscription expressing remorse is found not in Odisha but somewhere far beyond. He thus questions the motive behind such an expression of remorse. Another fresh aspect that Sanjeev Sanyal brings to limelight is the Southeast Asia connection and its influence on India and vice versa, which does not get focused in the Indian history we have been taught. The centrality of Indian Ocean trade is ignored in political history. He draws our attention not only to the Chola conquest of the Indian Ocean region and the Orissa trade voyages, but also to the little known fact of how the Pallava kings had marital links with Cambodia. He cites the case of Nandivarman II, who came back to South India to occupy the vacant Pallava throne and who was Cambodian on his mother's side, as is clear. We should go and see the Kanchipuram temple he mentions, as is clear from his sculpted figure in the Vaikunta Perumal Kovil in Kanchipuram. Another interesting point Sanyal makes is how the Hindu temples in the south, very interesting point, I think my banker uncle will be interested in this, you see, how the South Indian temples acted like modern bank in which rich traders sailing all over kept their gold, and how the temples were patronized by the traders and not just the kings alone. When a major collapse of maritime trade happened, the temples also suffered heavily. I come to Vikram Sampath. Vikram Sampath from Karnataka, a very recent historian from the south, who has battled well-known historians both from abroad and India. There were court cases against him, you see, charges of plagiarism about his books on history, both from India and abroad, has made some thought-provoking observations on the need for shifting the very paradigm of Indian history hitherto taught. Like Sanyal, he too argues that the Marxist-led post-independence version controlled the discipline of historiography so autocratically that we hear only of a long litany of invasions in which we are a nation of losers, a conquered people. Delhi-centered historians obscure other Indian dynasties. There is only a perfectory mention of the Vijayanagara, Pallava and Chola rulers. He makes us reflect on when he points out, I think Nalanda people may be able to tell us this, points out that Bhaktiar Khilji, who destroyed the library resources in the famed Nalanda University, is still commemorated in an odd way by naming the nearest station to the modern Nalanda University as Bhaktiarpur. Swamiji must confirm this, I really don't know. Vikram Sampath insists on India's need to reclaim its history from Delhi, which refuses to acknowledge the dark period of medieval history. Sampath entered into a dialogue with Shashi Tharoor. These are all public intellectuals. Shashi Tharoor, who defended the post-independence version as an attempt to build a new nation and pleaded that let the sleeping dogs die. Sampath argued that there is a historical wound which is a civilisational wound. He called for constituting a Truth and Reconciliation Commission as they did in post-apartheid South Africa. Shashi Tharoor was of the opinion that in the name of remembering the past wounds, we should not demonize the present citizens and make history, a key phrase, make history an imagined battlefield. In response to that, Vikram Sampath held that by memorializing the past, we don't mean to celebrate it. For example, I went to the Holocaust Museum. It's not meant to celebrate the Jewish genocide, but to impart a lesson. Vikram Sampath would like to go past both demonizing and secularizing, but recommends, he uses a phrase, invents a phrase, truthifying history. And thereby he shocks, I think, the anchor Rajdeep Sardesai, okay, by using the word truthifying history by recognizing the fault lies and not denying anything. Shashi Tharoor is of the view that we should not set up, I am coming to a very important part of my understanding of the subject, we should not set up a civilizational idea of India against the constitutional conception of India. According to him, there lies the fundamental fault line. So in this premises, we can ask this question, is there a civilizational idea of India which is to be pitted necessarily against a constitutional idea of India? Sampath contests that hypothesis by pointing out that the Marxist control of history has created several fault lines and they must be spoken about and mended. I am coming now to the third important public intellectual who is really unenviable in the way he speaks and the way he just marshals all his thoughts and ideas, his impeccable English and so on. The issue of the civilizational idea of India is put in opposition to the constitutional idea of India, creates an unhappy binary for me personally. In this respect, the arguments of J. Sai Dept, the Supreme Court lawyer who is a constitutional expert who has taken on the mantle of a historian, may be considered. Once again, in a public debate, Sai Dept confronts Shashi Tharoor. Sai Dept reminds us that Indians have welcomed for centuries so many different kinds of faiths and their culture. The oft-cited instances are the Jews. I think there is a Jew here in the assembly, a great friend of Swamiji. You are a Jew, aren't you, sir? Yes, Indian Jew, I should say. Okay, so the Jews and the early Christians and even the Armenians, there is a street called Armenian Street in Chennai. Sai Dept incisively points out that Indian people did so. This, in my understanding, is the kernel of my paper. Okay, where am I? Yes, he says that Indian people did so not out of any constitutional compulsion, for there was no constitution in those centuries, but out of a civilizational impulse to live and let live, so long as the immigrants did not attempt to interfere in our culture and faith. Hence, the value of a civilizational idea of India is not a myth, but the substratum of our culture. Sai Dept forcefully argues that to attribute, I remember it, I have memorized this line almost, to attribute such a large-heartedness entirely to a constitution is to protect the constitution at the expense of, protect the constitution at the expense of a civilization. Do we protect the constitution at the expense of a civilization, he asks. The constitution is itself a product of the fundamental pluralist spirit of the land. In one talk, he affirms that the constitution is a product of history, our history, and our history is not the product of the constitution. Hence, Hindu nationalism is nothing but dharmic civilization, and dharma is the reservoir of this country's public morality. Sai Dept distinguishes between, this is another point which I've been interested for long years, Mr. Pattabiraman. So he asked me, what is this topic about? Okay, so he distinguishes between identity and consciousness. Indic awakening is not identity politics. Today politicians are playing with identity, but Indic awakening is not identity politics. Accommodation is the spirit of the country. The way of life is being presented as a dharmic reawakening of India. It is not xenophobia nor ethnocentrism, which are the hallmarks of European nationalism, as he categorically asserts. When Shashi Tharoor reminds him that tolerance is less of a virtue than acceptance, Sai Dept replies that we have had enough of filters of colonialism and secularism which prevents us from accessing this dharma in the name of secularism. It is regrettable, even disconcerting, that Hindus are the subject of constant scrutiny, not the others, he says. The Hindu community does not get the credit it deserves. Any concept of understanding should not be divorced from the unique cultural experience. Now I come to a very contentious zone, cultural and linguistic divides. Professor Panniselvam has a lot to say on this. Cultural and linguistic divides. Connected to the issues of a civilizational idea of India and civilizational consciousness is the issue of cultural and linguistic schools of nationalism and exceptionalism, which currently polarizes our society. It is largely predicated on the paradigm of Aryan invasion, within quotes, and the challenge to it by the Dravidian cultural ideologues. Shrihariprasd has clearly stressed that the word Aryan is not a racial term of reference, but refers to a noble, strong person. But in the last 2 decades, the claim of hegemony, nay, even invasion by the Aryans, and the assertion of a separate, exclusive linguistic identity by the proponents of Dravidianism has had several resonances in the cultural and political spheres. Dravidianism may be understood as an ideology which holds that the Tamil country and its culture, not to omit the Tamil language, have always been independent, and that it has to assert its uniqueness and reclaim its identity by rejecting the superimposition of Vedic and Aryan culture. In the current discourse, it even claims that the state, this is something all of us have to ponder, they often say it, very often they say it now. In the current discourse, it even claims that the state is part of the nation only based on the constitution and not in terms of its linguistic and cultural affiliation with any larger idea of the Indian civilization. Such a self-perception impels the proponents and leaders to resist all alleged moves to swamp their separate selfhood. Those who oppose this polarization argue that the Aryan-Dravidian divide is a product of pre-colonial understanding. In fact, it is a colonial construction deliberately foisted on this country by the colonial rulers to divide and rule its people, and fostered by Christian missionaries, pardon me, Father, okay, like Caldwell and East India Company officials. He has a point, he has asked me something on that. Okay, officials like F.W. Ellis, who was in the Madras presidency, see, okay. In recent times, in the seminars organized by Swadeshi Indology, knowledgeable people have made presentations in the field of linguistics. Okay, they have challenged Sheldon Pollock. Some of the lady scholars have challenged Sheldon Pollock. Swadeshi Indology, I must tell Sri Kumar, as I said, I am a lay person. I have watched many of these things. I have put all these videos which I listened to, took down notes. I even brought the notes to show you that I have worked on it. But I could not give any book reference because I am thinking that media influences a lot people. And so a book will probably get into a paper. Only a few people can read it. Okay, that's just to defend myself. Sorry. Swadeshi Indology, knowledgeable people had made presentations in the field of linguistics, genetics, cultural history, and even performance studies and community entrepreneurship to refute the conflation of race and linguistic theories. Sanjeev Sanyal and Sai Deepak have categorically rejected the hypothesis of Aryan invasion, expatiating upon the gradual nature of migration, sometimes necessitated by geological and phenomenal crises. The obvious manifestation of this polarization is figured forth in the binary of Sanskrit versus Tamil in language politics. It has its echoes in the field of archaeology and epigraphy in the last 3 years or so, when the present Tamil Nadu government has valorized the findings in the site Keeladi and other diggings, pits, you see, which suggests pushing the urban history of pre-Sangam Tamil culture to a few centuries earlier than understood by the Archaeological Survey of Society of India. It also takes a polemical turn where this evidence and claim are pitted against the earlier positions taken by eminent epigraphists and the archaeologists like Dr. Nagaswami, who presented a pan-Indian picture of the subcontinental civilization. Next section, economic and societal concerns. I am purely a layperson, forgive me if there is any error. From the intellectual level, we now come to the domain of material matrix. One of the segments of the recent debates on Indian civilizational legacy is the negative perception of India in the global international media in the last decade. Roughly speaking, India's rating is downgraded in economic growth, human rights, functioning of democracy, human development index, and press freedom. These are some of the indices which are employed by the so-called international ranking agencies such as Economist Intelligence Unit, EIU, VDEM, Variety of Democratic Institute of Sweden, Freedom House, Washington-based think tank aiding the White House, and Freedom World Index, etc. Indian democracy has been dubbed as, to quote Professor Salvatore Babonis, an electoral autocracy. In the colonial times too, there were infamous negative perceptions and evaluation of Indian civilization and polity, to which Sri Aurobindo gave counter images and elaborate counter arguments in books such as The Slender Renaissance in India, which is hardly 52 pages, and The Monumental Foundations of Indian Culture, not to omit his other essays and articles. Today, there is a rearguard action by a band of young scholars who are trained economists as well as historians. Another group of defenders are some of the Indian Americans who are intimately acquainted with how American academia function under the garb of promoting cutting-edge research. The picture of the debates concerning democracy and economic aspects of our country is very grim. Professor Clooney has a comment on that later. The above-mentioned ranking agencies have drawn support from a few Indian think tanks to engage, to quote, data mining in the last 10 years or so, when there is a perceived Hindu resurgence in the country. The data so-called presents a rather bleak picture of Indian society in terms of the indices mentioned above. Global media like Washington Post and New York Times use the data and ranking to critique Indian civilization and its democratic legacy. Hence, the material domain also affects our own perception of our civilizational ethos. To unravel the processes by which such rankings are made, economist Sanjeev Sanyal from India, the Indologist Rajiv Malhotra and Vijaya Viswanathan from USA, and a sociologist, Professor Salvatore Babonis from the University of Sydney, basically an American but settled in Sydney, have studied the methodology employed and exposed the unreliability of such ratings. Sanjeev Sanyal questions the very validity of the method of a few select left-oriented individuals and scholars who are heavily biased against any talk of Indian civilizational legacy. Sanyal asserts that the indices themselves are erroneous and the data used fallible. He demonstrates, this is a very shocking revelation he gives us, he demonstrates to our dismay how under the sub-index democracy, India is rated lower than Afghanistan. Under democracy, India is rated lower than Afghanistan and Yemen, which are war-torn countries. The agencies which conduct this survey are mostly from European countries, which are constitutional monarchies, but they presume they are inherently democratic. They argue that India does not hold a referendum or direct election to select its head of state, and hence it is a flawed democracy. This is the phrase used, India is a flawed democracy. Its flawed nature is further accentuated by the so-called assault on press freedom and the poor human rights picture. Sanyal asks how they can maneuver a highly ideology-based perception about India and present a negative image to the world funding agencies. That is where the problem. The samples collected are also suspect, and the period chosen for scrutiny, namely the last 10 years, is deliberately singled out. For this picture impacts on global funding agencies like the World Bank. Sanyal faults them, that is both the agencies and their indices, and their reliance on select informants. Professor Salvatore Babonis views the subject as an outsider and exposes the role played by Indian intellectuals in feeding these agencies with negative data. Unlike Sanyal, he does not fault the agencies or the indices themselves. He censures the informants who constitute the Indian intellectual class. I am quoting a very important statement he has made, that this Indian intellectual class are anti-India. Quotation is anti-India. He goes to the extent of labeling them as mendacious academics. A very difficult word, mendacity, mendacious. I was so surprised to find that word. He calls them mendacious academics. Moreover, he points to the inherent injustice in comparing India, say, another interesting point, with Rwanda or Yemen. He says all these countries are rated poor countries, but he shows how among the decolonized poor countries, India alone has an unbroken record of regular general elections peacefully held to elect those who will govern the country. On the other hand, some of the African countries in Rwanda or Congo or even Nigeria, my sister who has lived there, my elder sister and her husband, she has come here, she can just vouch for what kind of life was in Nigeria, lost all semblance of democracy very shortly after gaining independence. Hence, Professor Babonis indicts the empirical manipulation in this exercise in creating the database. Now we come to a very important idea. Database we think is empirical, objective, but database is also something that is constructed, and the data can be cherry-picked. That is the word which they use. So, the data is cherry-picked, he alleges. He calls such cherry-picked data as full of mendacity. It's not my word, he uses the word mendacity. For example, data drawn from select NGO reports, data mining is surely wrongly used. Is India a fascist state? Everyone asks us now. Are you living in a fascist state? And is India now a failed state? Then, next section, Neo-Orientalism and Wokism. Wokism is exploited to indict Indian civilization. Rajiv Malhotra and Vijaya Viswanathan argue that there is a collusion between American universities like Harvard and Indian private universities like Ashoka and Kriya in generating statistics by data mining under an academic garb. An insidious output of this exercise is the contribution of Indian or Indian origin corporate barons. I hope there is none here. Okay, corporate barons who have set up chairs in universities like Harvard to promote covert anti-India researchers. For example, Lakshmi Mittal Center for South Asian Studies in Harvard. Vijaya Viswanathan alleges that Wokism, which is construed as an open articulation of voices against injustice, is in operation in these researchers. Their proponents being wooed by the left, who align themselves with the marginalized Indians. She finds a nefarious collusion between the corporates, which are outwardly against all Woks, and the woke scholars who are disgruntled ideologues. The researchers of those woke scholars have served to undermine the Indian civilization in the global perception, argues Rajiv Malhotra in the program he has organized in the last decade under the aegis of the Infinity Foundation and the various talks he has given in other organizations. Significantly enough, both Rajiv Malhotra and Vijaya Viswanathan throw into relief how such neo-Oriental studies have found allies among the proponents of critical race theory. Once again, Professor Clooney is there in the United States and formed a common platform of oppression to denounce the claims of Indian civilization as an inclusive and humanist civilization. So, critical race theory. Malhotra and Viswanathan point out that the American universities which promote such studies of discrimination elsewhere in the world have not facilitated removal of the problem in their own society. An important aspect of Rajiv Malhotra's crusade against anti-India researchers is his call for what he calls civilisational audit. He uses this phrase, civilisational audit, by the Indian industrial houses, for example, Piramal Center, the Lakshmi Mittal Center, because they are promoting researches in anthropology and sociology to undermine the civilisational values. Anthropology and sociology have been the center of study and research both within India and abroad. That is to say, there is a keener interest now in relating all researches in humanities to empirical methods followed in social sciences than in the abstract pursuit of the conceptions in philosophy or religion. Professor Clooney and also Professor Paneerselvam have stoutly contested this, that philosophy and religion talk about abstract things and they don't have any kind of impact on our daily life. So Professor Clooney is here, he will tell you. For example, study of Adivasi rights, the environmental policies affecting their lifestyle, the linguist Ganesh Devi's research on the dying dialects of Indian languages, media focus on Hinduization of worship in some Kerala temples where the practices are different, urbanization and its impact on indigenous cultures, studying proselytization and condemning majoritarian reactions in places like Chhattisgarh and Odisha, or study of the plight of Devadasis and blaming it on the abolition of the system of Devadasi. Rajiv Malhotra reminds us that any refusal, that's something about him. He wants to engage with these problems and issues and people who are against Indian civilization. Refusal to engage with the other position is opposed to the long tradition of civilized debate in India, be it in philosophy or hermeneutics. There have been the time-tested Vada tradition. I think Professor CLR is here. Vada tradition, Samvada, Samanvaya, all that you see, tradition, and the Samvada and Samanvaya traditions. We may recall that even Gandhi and Ambedkar were engaged in such a debate over the issue of communal reservation, as noted in any discussion of the Pune Pact, although Ambedkar was not happy to concede Gandhiji's position. Rajiv Malhotra regrets that now this tradition has given up because of what he calls cancel culture, a new phenomenon in public discourse which is dominated by what Vishwanathan calls digital caste system. That is, those who are on top of the pyramid veto the other discourses. Recently, Swami Sarvapriyananda of the Vedanta Center of Ramakrishna Order in New York has expressed his disappointment with Harvard University in allowing anti-India moves, citing demonstrations by Indian students against their country. He has observed that no other students from any other countries protest against their respective nations on an alien soil. If Orientalism in the early colonial era of 18th century brought Europe's attention to the astonishing range of knowledge systems in India, Edward Said's influential book Orientalism in the mid-20th century challenged European Orientalism and its assumptions about Middle East and Asian countries. And in the process, it inaugurated an alternative critical discourse. Ever since, academic and public discourses have prioritized articulation of marginalized positions as the linchpin of Neo-Orientalism. While no serious-minded person would deny the presence of oppression and injustice in India and other countries, on that score to condemn a whole civilization and culture is counterproductive, posing the danger of blighting the hopes of keeping an Indian polity together. This turn of thinking has taken a predominantly anti-Hindu color and rejection of our cultural legacy in various fields, as Professor Sampath Kumar would just view it, in many of his talks that he has given here. Final section. Where do we go from here? We have now familiarized ourselves with what Rajiv Malhotra repeatedly calls Purva Paksha, that is, the position of the opponents to the claim of Indian civilizational legacy. At this point of time, what is a counter or rather complementary position which those who are concerned with its inherent value can take? Rajiv Malhotra asks, why cannot religious and spiritual organizations engage in deeper studies based on a structured methodology of research to refute the alleged misrepresentations? He says, perhaps we have not developed the skills. There is a need for professional approach to knowledge building, which will claim its space in the academia and society at large. It may be recalled that the nature and contents of textbooks on history have varied from educational system to system, from region to region. As one who studied in Tamil Nadu, the focus I know would be on the glorious rule of the Chola. Must have been a staple feature. I take it that Vijayanagara rule would have been given due prominence in Karnataka syllabus. By way of a counter to the arguments of Sanyal and Sampath, we may point out in the field of research that there have been impactful studies such as Professor K.A. Neelakanta Shastri's The Cholas, or my own Tamil professor, Dr. S.N. Kanda Swami's studies on Indian epistemologies and on Buddhism and Jainism in Tamil Nadu. How much of that research can be incorporated in school textbooks is a debatable matter. It's a different question. In my own limited experience in life, in professional field, the texture of life had undergone a sea change in the last 25 years or so. That helped me to use creatively the altered floor space in approaching even traditional subjects like Shakespeare, and definitely while handling cutting-edge field like critical theory and literary theory. A topic like marginalization could be examined using the recently researched data in the field of cricket on what castes have dominated the selection of Indian teams and social backgrounds of the players who did not get much opportunity to showcase their talents. Data on this point was cherry-picked by Professor Robin Jeffrey when I was there listening to him in the Australian National University, Canberra, and the patronage and coverage he got from the media, especially the Hindu, was also focused. The justice of the study was admitted while noting that the concomitant changes in the socio-economic domains which facilitated a Natarajan, popularly called Nadu in cricket circles, to play in all the three formats in Australia a few years back and prove his mettle. On the other hand, the cherry-picked data and its interpretation of a study of the sport of cricket since the era of television rights by a British columnist of The Economist, James Astell, in his very colonial-sounding title, The Great Tamasha. Anything that he writes about India must be a Tamasha. The Great Tamasha, 2013, significantly titled Cricket, Corruption and the Turbulent Rise of Modern India, came in handy to discuss colonialism and I am daring to use Heidegger's term, and Professor Panneerselvam may comment on that. My own thrown-inness facilitated my interacting with heterogeneous strata and levels in different senses of the terms. It was not a static relationship of teacher and taught. I evolved as a human being and a professional and could constitute a nucleus of interrelations, and I found that they were cherished moments of mutual enlightenment and an understanding of the deeper values of life, which has lasted between me and those whom I interact with till today, despite holding varying positions in many matters. Coming to the issue of prestigious universities in the US generating anti-India research, it may be in place to recall here that there is also the other side of a university like Harvard, where significant research has been done enriching Indian religious and philosophical studies, especially relating to South India. Professor J.B. Kaman's work on Acharya Ramanuja is monumental. And Professor Clooney, I thought he was a student of Professor Kaman, but he has just said that he was only, he learned a lot from him, but he was never his formal student. But Professor Clooney is a friend of Sri Vishnu Mohan Foundation. Professor Kaman is an authority on Vedanta Deshika. Professor Clooney is an authority of Vedanta Deshika, Manavala Mamunigal. He is now doing research on Nalayara Divya Prabandham. He is translating them into Tamil and so on. Recently, Professor Clooney has given a public statement agreeing with many of the charges leveled by Rajiv Malhotra regarding Harvard's hidden agenda in using Indian corporates and Indian scholars to produce a negative image of Indian society. He is here, he will tell you. So, however, he has underscored the other Harvard and its positive India studies foci. I may mention to those who have assembled here who may not be familiar with how Sri Peetam and Sri Vishnu Mohan Foundation, under the spiritual and intellectual leadership of Swami Hariprasd, have been calmly and resolutely taking steps towards the goal of removing misconceptions about Sanatana Dharma. Nobody else would have allowed me to speak on this topic here except Swamiji, which may be studied to rewrite the hostile narratives. The annual peace conferences on a variety of relevant topics. I hear that Shashi Tharoor has been invited to speak in the next peace conference. Whom is he going to pit with? I don't know. Which Swamiji has organized at Sri Peetam sees flocking of heterogeneous cultural and professional scholars who examine the issues of the topic in a given year. For example, family, right education. Next is going to be peace and justice, if I remember right. Okay, who examines the issue of a given year, family, right education. Scores of seminars are organized on the deeper value systems of our civilization, roping scholars from Shillong to Kanyakumari, Southeast Asia, South Africa, Sri Lanka and the West. Monks, bhikshus, clerics, priests, secularists, believers, non-believers, academics are all given free space to air their positions. Students from non-elite institutions are specially invited to participate and benefit from the exchanges. The foundation also aims to publish books which will conduce to a deeper understanding of the immense reservoir of knowledge that is available. I may be permitted to mention how Swamiji organized a very thoughtful seminar to mark the 750th year of Swami Vedanta Deshika and published a volume, Hayagrivam Upasmahe, containing erudite and revealing articles on the Vaishnava Acharya of medieval times as an exemplar of astounding knowledge, wisdom. Apart from these meets, the wisdom aspect, Jnana, as Rajiv Malhotra says, wisdom aspect of our civilization has been quietly imparted by Swamiji and his designated scholars to those who are keen aspirants. Dr. CLR is here, Professor Srinivasan is there, Professor Venkatakrishnan is there. So, and yet, no discrimination is made in terms of creed, caste, gender, material, color, and yet uplifting the collective spirit of our society to underscore the core realizations of Sadguru Jnananda Saraswati Swami is a fulcrum on which the pillars of the Peetam are silently and steadfastly erected by Swamiji. May the Sadguru continue to inspire and guide us all. I once again thank Swamiji and the donors of this endowment for the invitation to give this talk. May we all remember, finally, that we belong to a country of seekers as well as well-wishers. Pranams to Sri Sadguru and Swami Shrihariprasd. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Indra, for this interesting and very informative talk. Before we proceed further, a quick announcement. Given the fact that this topic is quite interesting and a lot of interactions are expected, we expect the seminar to extend beyond the standard close time at 12 o'clock, so maybe it might go on for another half an hour. So moving on, I now would like to welcome Professor Francis Clooney, Father Professor Francis Clooney, to deliver a response. Professor Francis Clooney is a Parkman Professor of Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology, Howard University, US. He is an internationally known scholar on Vaishnavism, Ramanuja, and translator of Alvar's hymns from Tamil to English. He has given many talks at Shrihariprasd on different occasions. I now request Professor Clooney to deliver.